Hey there. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going from sparks to signals. Have you ever wondered how neurons work? How do they send their electrical signals from one end of the neuron to the other? The answer is action potentials. So let's explore the fascinating world of action potentials. What are they? How are they generated? And how are they transmitted down the axon? Don't worry, we've got you covered. We'll break it down step by step so you can easily understand this complex process. Plus, we'll also look at how action potentials are received by other cells. It's gonna be an exciting ride, so buckle up and get ready to learn all about action potentials. Let's get started with our story about little sparks. Once upon a time in a land filled with tiny cells, there was a special kind of cell called a neuron. This neuron had a unique job to do, to carry messages from one part of the body to another. But how did it do this? Well, the answer lay in its ability to generate tiny electrical signals called action potentials. One day, the neuron received a message from a neighboring cell and a spark jumped across the gap between them. Wait, what just happened? Was that a magical fairy godmother waving her magic wand? Nope, not quite. What actually happened was something called an action potential. When the neuron received the initial message, it triggered a chain reaction inside the cell, causing positively charged particles called ions to flow through tiny channels in the neuron's membrane. This sudden influx of positive charge generated an electrical signal that raced down the neuron like a bolt of lightning. Wow, that's amazing. Just imagine the power of a single cell to generate such a strong signal. But that's not all. The action potential didn't stop at the first neuron. It continued on, jumping from one neuron to the next until it reached its destination. At each synapse, the electrical signal triggered the release of chemical messengers that carried the message across the gap to the next neuron. This incredible journey of the action potential allowed the body to communicate with itself, sending messages that controlled everything from muscle movement to hormone release. But wait, there's more. The strength of the action potential signal could actually vary depending on the strength of the initial stimulus. For example, if the initial message was a gentle nudge, the action potential would be a small signal. But if the stimulus was a strong command, the action potential would be a powerful surge of electricity. Isn't that incredible? A single cell capable of generating signals of varying strength to convey different messages. But how exactly does this work? Let's take a closer look inside the neuron. You see, the neuron has a cell body and a long extension called an axon. The axon is like a cable that carries the action potential signal from one end of the neuron to the other. But how does the signal get generated in the first place? Well, it all starts with the movement of ions. As we mentioned earlier, when the neuron receives a message from a neighboring cell, it triggers a chain reaction that causes positively charged ions to flow into the cell. This influx of positive charge alters the electrical balance of the neuron, creating a temporary state of excitation. But wait, why does this happen? Why does the neuron become excited? Well, it's all about communication. You see, neurons don't just randomly generate action potentials. They need a trigger, a stimulus that pushes them over the edge and sets off the chain reaction. This stimulus could be anything from a change in temperature to the arrival of a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger released by another cell. When the stimulus is strong enough, it reaches a certain threshold, and that's when the action potential is generated. Think of it like a seesaw. If you only have one person on one side, the seesaw won't tip over. But if you add another person to the same side, the weight will shift and the seesaw will tip. Similarly, if the stimulus is below the threshold, nothing happens. But once the stimulus reaches the threshold, the action potential is triggered. Now, once the action potential is generated, it's like a domino effect. It spreads rapidly down the axon, wave after wave, until it reaches the end of the neuron. But how does the signal jump from one neuron to the next? That's where synapses come in. A synapse is the tiny gap between two neurons, and to cross this gap, the action potential needs a little help. It triggers the release of neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carry the signal from one neuron to the next. These neurotransmitters are like tiny boats that ferry passengers across the synapse. Once they reach the other side, they bind to receptors on the next neuron, triggering the generation of a new action potential. And so the signal continues to travel throughout the body, jumping from neuron to neuron. So what have we learned today? We've learned that neurons use action potentials to send signals. An action potential is a sudden influx of positive charge that travels down the axon of a neuron. It's generated in response to a stimulus that reaches a certain threshold, and it spreads rapidly until it reaches the end of the neuron, where it triggers the release of neurotransmitters that carry the signal to the next neuron. But wait, there's more. There are different types of synapses, and the type of neurotransmitter released by the presynaptic neuron determines the type of response in the postsynaptic neuron. Some neurotransmitters excite the postsynaptic neuron, making it more likely to generate its own action potential. Others inhibit the postsynaptic neuron, making it less likely to generate an action potential. This allows for complex communication between neurons, with signals being turned on or turned off depending on the neurotransmitters involved. And here's another fascinating fact. The strength of the action potential signal can vary depending on the strength of the stimulus. A stronger stimulus leads to a stronger action potential, and a weaker stimulus leads to a weaker action potential. This allows for a wide range of responses to different stimuli, from a gentle touch to a painful sting. But what happens when things go wrong in the communication between neurons? What if the neurotransmitters aren't released properly, or the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron aren't working correctly? Well, that's a topic for another day. But suffice it to say that problems with neuronal communication are at the root of many neurological disorders. We hope you enjoyed learning about action potentials and synapses. If you want to dive deeper into the world of neuroscience, check out our other videos on topics like memory, decision-making, and consciousness. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an exciting new video. Thanks for watching and happy learning. Alright, let's move on to the next topic. Now it's time to take our understanding of action potentials to the next level. Get ready to explore how these electrical signals are received by other cells and how they trigger the release of chemical messengers that keep the communication flowing. You see, the end of a neuron doesn't just connect to any old cell. It forms a specialized junction with another cell, like a handshake between two friends. This junction is called a synapse, and it's here where the action potential meets its match. When an action potential reaches the end of a neuron, it triggers the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are like mail carriers that deliver important messages from one cell to another. But how do they get their message across the synapse? Well, that's where the magic happens. The neurotransmitters are released into the synapse and travel across the tiny gap to the other cell, where they bind to specific receptors like a key fitting into a lock. But wait, why is it important for the neurotransmitters to bind to specific receptors? Well, it's all about specificity. Just like how a key only fits into its matching lock, neurotransmitters can only bind to receptors that they're compatible with. This ensures that the message is delivered to the right cell and that the right message is received. But what happens when the message is delivered? Well, that depends on the type of cell that receives the signal. For example, if the receiving cell is a muscle cell, the neurotransmitter may trigger a contraction. Or if it's a gland cell, it may trigger the release of a hormone. Each type of neurotransmitter has a specific effect on its target cell, allowing for precise control over bodily functions. But what happens to the neurotransmitters after they've delivered their message? Well, they don't just disappear. They're either broken down by enzymes or reabsorbed by the sending cell, like a recycling program. This ensures that the message isn't received twice and that the communication between cells remains clear. So what have we learned about synapses? We have learned that synapses are the junctions between neurons or between a neuron and a target cell like a muscle or gland. They allow communication between cells through the release and reception of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters bind to specific receptors on the target cell, triggering a response. And finally, neurotransmitters are either broken down or reabsorbed after delivering their message. Understanding synapses is crucial for comprehending how the nervous system works. It's the basis of memory, learning, and countless other vital functions. So keep exploring and keep asking questions. Who knows what you might discover about the amazing world of synapses? If you found this topic interesting and want to know more about the human brain and its functions, consider subscribing to our channel. We've got plenty more videos covering various aspects of neuroscience that you might enjoy. Thanks for watching and happy learning.